All right. You came today, presumably, to talk about cultural leadership. And this is the last Leadership Cafe in the series, at least for this calendar year. And so if you've been with us for a while, you're familiar with the format. But for those of you who are just coming for the first time, we are going to present some material, ask some questions. We're going to be very open to dialogue, especially today. Hopefully today we're going to swap some fun stories about cross-cultural experiences, maybe lessons learned, maybe humorously learned, maybe some embarrassment there, who knows, but we'll see. But it's important that as we go through, you understand kind of what it is that we're looking for here. First of all, in all the material that we present, I am not going to give you a list of do's and a list of don'ts. I'm not going to say this is the one way to approach cultural leadership or the one way to approach culture. We're going to think through these issues critically. And so if you hear something that doesn't automatically register with you as being true, say something, bring it up. Let's pause and talk about this. The other thing is, the whole 2 hours that we spend together, there will be nuggets for you to take back to your leadership context, whether that's pastoring, whether that's working in the nonprofit world, wherever that is that you spend most of your time as a leader. There will be things that you can use today to build your capacity, and then there will be other things that you're like, okay, that's good head knowledge. If you want more resources, I made a handout for us. There's a small bibliography at the bottom. You will hear me mention those resources frequently. There's an entire world of literature out there about cross-cultural, cultural leadership. There are 100 TED Talks on it on YouTube. Everybody has done something about this. And so I'll tell you why I gave you the sources that I did. If you ask anybody else probably in this room, there will be other go-to books and sources that they like. And so if you feel that that's of benefit to everybody, bring them up and people will jot them down. Now, the reason that we're talking about cultural leadership is because in this evolution of leadership theory, in this evolution of studying how people think and process information, for a long time, leaders were defined by their IQ. Their intelligence quotient, you had to be smart. And as long as you were smart, as long as you could get a high number on the IQ test and pass all the puzzles and do those things, that meant you were probably going to be a good leader. And that thinking persisted for a long time. And then this idea of EQ, this emotional intelligence quotient, got thrown in there and said, well, it's not just IQ. Now it's IQ and EQ. And so there's this finicky thing about leading people, is people are all different. And people have different tics and rhythms and processes and personality styles. And so EQ was one way that researchers took a shot at trying to understand that. So from IQ went to EQ, and then comes this cultural intelligence quotient, this idea of CQ. And so most people who look at leadership in a holistic fashion tend to look at it as a combination of all of those quotients, IQ, EQ, and CQ. It's probably the last time today that we're going to mention CQ specifically, but you need to know kind of that's where we are in the evolution of things. Now, before we get rolling too much, I want us to spend some time around the tables sharing your experiences with different cultures. Maybe you speak a different language or multiple languages. Maybe you were born in a different country or spend some time in different areas. Whatever it is, I want you to, around your table, and if you want to combine tables, that'd be fine, but just to share your experiences for a few minutes, because your experience is a crucial basis, a foundation for approaching this idea of cultural leadership. I want to give you this quote here. It says, as borders are blurred by globalization, cultural differences are magnified. In essence, as the world gets smaller, cultures are going to have more and more opportunity to connect with each other, maybe to abruptly bump into one another. And so what can we learn from this idea that as the global boundaries are blurred and cultures come together, what do we need to be on the lookout for? What have we learned thus far in our own personal experiences? And just to kind of get us rolling, I'll tell you, I was born and raised in Colorado, which is a different culture than Texas. We probably won't pick on that one too much, but if I need to, I'm going to play that card. So I can freely make fun of Texas and Colorado equally. I have now lived in Texas longer than I lived in Colorado, which is something I swore I would never do. In fact, I told my wife we have to move. 3 years ago, I said we have to move, because if we don't, I'm going to live in Texas longer than Colorado, and my family will not let me live that down. That has happened, and my family was good to that. They have not let me live that down. Especially in the summertime when they're texting me and it's 80 degrees in Colorado and it's, well, not 80 degrees here, unless it's 3 in the morning. I spent my senior year of high school in Stuttgart, Germany. I was living on an army base there. I was playing for a German soccer team, attending an American high school. I had taken some German in my American high school in Colorado, so I had just enough German to go out into culture, cause a little bit of trouble. I was a high school senior after all. And mostly, for the most part, get myself out of trouble without requiring a call to the base MPs to come get me. My classmates cannot all say that, though. So I spent some time in Germany. Because I was a military brat, I've had the opportunity to travel around the world to various places and spend time in various cultures. I spent a little bit of time in Russia. I've spent a little bit of time in Japan. And I've spent some time bebopping around Europe. So I have been a witness to several language instruction courses. I took German, I took a little bit of Russian, I took a little bit of Japanese. I kept moving from educational institutions before I could really acquire any decency in any of those languages. And so I usually know enough to say 3 or 4 words, usually involving where's the bathroom, where's the door, hello, goodbye, that kind of thing. That is my cultural experience. Now, I'll tell you about my research background maybe a little bit later, but around the table, just share with the other people. Introduce yourself if you haven't yet, but just spend the next, let's say, 5 minutes talking about your own culture and your own cross-cultural experiences. Go. All right. As you have shared stories around your table, anybody want to give one to the room, your own cross-cultural experience or cultural experience, your cultural background? Anybody hear anything? This is usually when the finger pointing starts. He's got a good story, she's got a good story. So share with us, where are you from? What languages are spoken? Give me a read of the room, somebody. What did you hear?
I was born and raised a Texan.
Okay.
And had traveled some out of the state of Texas, some internationally, but in '97, while I was pastor at First Baptist Beaumont, I had the opportunity to go on a mission tour for senior pastors to India, and went to New Delhi, and then we divided up with missionaries and went to different parts of India, and I was assigned to go with the missionary to Hyderabad. And so we were in the city of Hyderabad for about a week, and he wanted me to meet a young couple that he had met and began discipling and engaging with in the gospel. And so we were in the motel, and he had to go take a call or something, so I'm stuck there with this young couple trying to figure out some type of dialogue. And Ben is the missionary's name. He had told me that this couple had just got married. You know, they were newly married. So I made the classic American mistake of asking them how long they had been dating before they got married and when did they meet, and they just stared at me like a calf at a new gate, you know. And that would make no sense to them at all whatsoever either, you know. So that just was not in their cultural mindset to be able to even answer that type of question. Yeah. Obviously a very arranged marriage.
Yeah. Anybody else? Good stories? All right. You will be encouraged at several points along the way to share those if you feel so inclined. But let's talk about what culture is. Now, if you have been in any kind of cultural intelligence, cultural awareness, any of those kind of seminars, you were expecting a picture of an iceberg at some point. And so I figured we would just get that out of the way, okay? Here's the obligatory picture of an iceberg. Because so much of culture is below the surface. But we're going to just take a few minutes today and talk about what it is that is below the surface, and not as far as distinct behaviors. We'll get to a little bit of that as we go on today. But I want to give you this quote, and I'll tell you more about the researchers that developed this quote later, but it says, "Culture is defined as shared motives, values, beliefs, identities, and interpretations or meanings of significant events that result from common experiences of members of collectives and are transmitted across generations." Now, you know that a bunch of PhDs wrote this definition, right? Because that is the wonkiest way of talking about culture ever. But it starts with, and I bolded this word, values. This underlying what we perceive as a value colors so much of how we think and how we act and how we behave and what our attitudes are, where our prejudices are, what we accept as normal. All of that stems from our values. In fact, a prominent researcher talked about culture as being a collective programming of the mind. And here's what he meant by that. When he talks about a collective programming of the mind, he tends to talk about head, heart, and hands. And head, heart, hands as it aligns to how you think, how you feel, and how you act, and how those three things translate into what you believe, your attitudes, and we're going to park on that for just a second, and then your skills. So here's the question for the room. What is the difference between a belief and an attitude? There's no Sunday school answer here, so there's no right or wrong. I'm not leading you into any one particular direction, but let's just flesh that out. If head and heart are different, and you got to kind of accept that, what is the difference between a belief and an attitude? You got a guess?
I got to put those three things up there into the cognitive, affective, and behavioral domains.
Okay.
And I think that helps me when maybe not. Somebody pick it up from there.
So Ed just threw out cognitive, affective, and what was the third one? Behavioral, thank you. Domains. And then he left it there. So, okay. Well, now let's talk about that though, because he just made the same distinction though, cognitive and affective. What's the difference between what you believe about something and an attitude toward something? They're not distinctly exclusive concepts. There is some relation between the two, but what's the difference there?
Well, I'll try to give a Sunday school answer.
Okay.
I can believe that God has created all men equal.
Okay.
But because of my cultural raising and because of my context of life, I may have a different attitude towards someone than what my belief system actually tries to impress upon me. And that even then flows into my actions toward them. So it's my attitude that affects my actions more so than my belief that affects my actions.
Right. And that was a great way of putting it. If you simply cognitively process something and you just think it through, and that translated automatically to your actions, would it look dramatically different than if you throw the attitude piece in there? Yeah, it would look drastically different because, like you said, you're processing something to be true, to be rational, and then you remember we're all human beings and rationality doesn't always win the day. And so your beliefs, your thinking, your cognitive formations about specific ideas and perspectives is one thing, and then the attitude is kind of this emotional component, the part of yourself that you present and that you bring to the equation that's probably not always as well thought out and processed and rational. And when you jumble all that together, it plays into the behavior that is expressed, right? So now, Are you buying into the idea that that there is a connection between the skills a person learns and the culture, specifically that cultural programming of the mind? Is there a connection between culture and skills? What do you think?
Yes, there is and there is not.
There is and there isn't. I love it. Okay, go for
I
it.
just thought when you were talking about this, it's just from the before Christ and after Christ with me.
Okay.
What I was thinking, how I was behaving before, and what do I think and how do I behave now.
Okay.
So, yes and no, right?
Sure.
Sure. The beliefs are going to change, of course, because the Holy Spirit is working in me. And my attitude is going to change. It's changing every day.
Sure.
And my actions are going to change. So the more I know, for me, the reading of the Bible and all these processes in the first one, the thinking. And then how do I process that will be in my heart, the feeling and the attitude that I take. I've been changing a lot, even though I've been traveling a lot also, and I'm from Puerto Rico. And when I go to South America or Central America, that's a new culture for me, so I have to adjust a lot. And then my actions are guided by Christ, so yes.
Yeah, and in essence, actually, what you're describing is an overlapping and sometimes conflict within cultures. You know, if you like for me, I don't have a whole lot. I became a Christian at a very young age, and so I don't have a whole lot of pre-Christian life to contrast to my, I was raised in church, which brings with it its own little cultural field of landmines. But what you're describing is kind of that ongoing transformational beliefs, attitudes, feelings, actions, all of that jumbled into one. And then you bring the cultural component to it, like the ethnic cultural component to it as you go from Puerto Rico to Central to South to other places. Is there a connection between one's culture and the skills that person develops? Give me an example. Even if you say nope, then let's go there. Is there a connection between culture and skills?
I think so. I'm not expert in cultures, but like for example, the Jewish culture is in tune to the in the context of reading. And so what that does is that foster a culture of skills that is very much analytical and they think, they read, because that's that foundation.
Sure.
And I think also what you see is a lot of the Asian culture coming from the Taoist Confucius background, so that there is that value of family and parenting and all that stuff. And so the skills are more enhanced.
Yeah.
As a result of that. Of course, we're all fallen creatures,
Sure.
sinners saved by grace. There are strengths, but ultimately those strengths can become the weaknesses.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Somebody else.
When
Sir.
when I attended orchestra for my grandkids, my grandson's orchestra in school, and the whole team, about 75%, more than that, I think, from Asia.
Okay.
And they don't send their people, to sports too much,
Okay.
but to musician, to piano or violin or this. So I think that's cultural thing. They feel that is the area to pursue
Sure.
and develop the skill in that way.
Yeah.
I've got an excellent example from when I was overseas in Africa. So I was a missionary for a while in Africa, and where I served was out in the bush, and literacy was low. Most people there weren't readers, so it's the opposite of the situation you're in. But the culture had such a very high value placed on storytelling that they're all excellent storytellers. In fact, they're all audible learners because of it. And so they'll sit around a fire, or they'll sit around a meeting tree, and they'll all spin yarns. They'll tell their tales, right? And they'll hear it once, and they'll be able to repeat it. Now, you have your average American sit down and try to hear a story and then turn around and regurgitate it the same way. We can't do that at all. But we're much more literate learners, and so we're going to want to refer to the text over and over again. And so there's a completely different skill set. it shapes the way you both learn and then the way that you can turn around and teach.
Yeah. Yeah, because part of what culture is, and we're going to get to this in a minute, is culture is part of what informs you as a person, what you need to be good at in order to advance in your particular culture. So storytelling is a vital skill, and at some levels of social interaction, if you want to be included in that, you have to be a good storyteller. There are other cultures where you have to be a good listener, or you have to be very consensus building, or in other areas of the world, you have to not be consensus building at all. You have to be very decisive or very ready to debate, or people think you are not processing through the issue. And we'll play with some of those global differences here in a minute. But value and culture informs, it's kind of a reinforcing loop. Your values enforce your culture, and your culture enforces your values. So as we kind of think through that, there are also different levels of culture, and here's another iceberg pic, okay? I like this picture of the iceberg better because you can actually see some of the stuff that is below the surface. That gives you an idea that there is depth there. And so when researchers talk about multiple layers of culture, they talk about what is done at the national level, the corporate level, or the professional level. And so you can see that within countries, as you boil down from countries to regions, more in countries that have been established for a long time, as opposed to some countries that have only been around a few decades, in some cases, a few years in other cases, where there is no real national ethos, but maybe it's a tribal or a regional ethos. You can definitely see this within the United States as you go from state to state to state. You can also see this if you were to look at organizations, especially big organizations that have different divisions or different silo setup or different departments. Sometimes you can actually see this within smaller organizations if the teams are really cohesive. And so like in a church environment, if there are, I was a youth minister when I was coming up through ministry circles, and the youth staff we were a bunch of animals, right? Like we were just a different crowd, and we prided ourselves on being different, and the more senior ministers prided themselves on not being like us, and so there was a mutual understanding there. The youth team, they're weird, and it's their job to be weird, and we all hope they'll grow out of it at some point. That was kind of the attitude towards us. And so you see culture expressed at different levels, but you also see this exchange, we can work the different levels of culture when it suits our needs, right? You see this in wartime, where countries who have distinct regional biases and differences are attacked from an outside aggressor, and all of a sudden, all of the culture is about that national ethos, right? And then in peacetime, everybody, kind of gravitates back toward their most local level of culture. And again, they gravitate toward that most local level of culture because that is what you were kind of raised to think is most correct. And so we see a quote here that says, culture means normal, and culture means best. Culture is what informs us what is weird and what is not weird. And culture informs us and helps us think through, for better or for worse in some cases, what is the best way to be, if there is even such a thing. But culture kind of gives you that ground zero that you run back to and say, well, I was taught that you do it this way. And maybe I wasn't explicitly taught, maybe I was just implicitly taught. I have, just to use a really weird example, I have certain cultural understandings of how a family celebrates Christmas. Even in my family, it was a split family very early on, but for me, Christmas is not Christmas unless we are getting in a car and going to Grandma and Grandpa's house. If there are not 15, 20 people in the room, it's what happened to everybody and when are they getting here? Are we not doing Christmas on Christmas Day? When does the mass of people get here? That's how I celebrate Christmas. My wife comes from a different kind of cultural background. Christmas is done in small, very immediate family. And so she and I had a lot of conversations when we were newlyweds about how are we going to navigate this whole thing, because Christmas for me means a crowd, and I'm an introvert, so I don't really gravitate toward crowds, but it's all okay at Christmas time for some reason, right? Like I turn into an extrovert at Christmas time. At New Year's Day though, it's done. I'm going right back to being an introvert. And so culture in some ways makes us ethnocentric, right? It makes us kind of think the world revolves around us. And so as we kind of process through that though, it makes it a little weird to talk about culture. Sometimes this makes people uncomfortable. And inevitably what happens in conversations like this is we start painting with pretty broad strokes, right? We start bringing up the stereotypes. Now, I have a throwaway line about stereotypes. There is some element of a stereotype that's true or it wouldn't exist, okay? Now, Aggie jokes tend to write themselves. Am I not telling the truth here, Mr. UT? So, I mean, there are certain stereotypes that more broadly apply than others. But as we get into what cultural leadership looks like and we start contrasting cultures against each other, I want you to kind of hold that in attention, right? So there's a stereotype that we tend to gravitate to. There are exceptions to that, and there are ranges within cultural stereotypes. And then there's kind of that element of, okay, well, that actually rings true. Now, the other thing that we need to remember is culture is learned very young. I like this picture because this is a child learning about culture. He's actually taking a picture of this wall, and without anybody telling him, hey, you are really studying your culture, he's studying his culture. He's studying and learning. And depending on who you ask, most researchers think the majority of your culture is defined by 8 years old. I've heard it put another way, 80% of your worldview is defined by 8 years old. I've seen a couple of other estimates that say 6, 7 years old, the majority of your worldview is defined. As the parent of a 6-year-old, that scares the daylights out of me. You know, especially preparing for this, I'm like, oh my goodness, what is Gavin learning as a culture? You know, and I'm Norwegian. Does he know anything about Norwegian? He's 6. Does he have to know anything about Norwegian? You know, so all of that is swimming in there. But it's amazing how fast you pick things up. And when we talk about culture, we're not just talking about the ethnic roots. We're talking about the basic elements of your worldview, such as, is the world a fundamentally safe place or not? Are people fundamentally good or not? Is there a God? Does he care about us? Is there a God? Does he not care about us? All of those questions start to really get solidified at 6, 7, 8 years old. Which also, as we kind of look at how to lead in these environments, brings up the question of your core versus the things that are flexible for you. So when it comes to values, when it comes to beliefs, there are things about your culture that you are never going to let go of. They are core to your being. And then there are other things that are kind of on the outside that are preferences, right? Culture is what teaches us what's best and what's normal. But then there are the other things that you kind of grew up understanding this to be true, and you get exposed to other cultures, you have different experiences, whatever it is, and you start to realize, oh, I hold that kind of loosely. That was a preference of mine. I don't have to have it that way. You see this this is where fights break out in the church world all the time, right? What is core to especially how we do church services, and what is a preference to how we do church services? Does there have to be a choir or not? Does there if there are words on the screen, is that a violation? Is there, do you have to have a hymnal? Do you stand? Do you sit? Are there pews? Are there chairs? Is there one aisle? Are there many aisles? All of these things. And as you start to kind of understand your own paradigms and your own cultural and your own understanding, it makes it easier to understand other cultures. And so there is a way to approach culture by saying, let's just learn about the world. And then the other way to approach culture is understand the difference between what you hold to be core and what you hold to be preference, and then bring that understanding to other cultures and experiences as you have them. So we're going to do a little bit of both today as we as we look at cultural leadership. Now, I'm going to show you a slide, and this is based on a study that is technically ongoing, but it went on for 10 years, and it looked at different cultures around the world. And these are, now I know this is a nasty looking slide, I get that, and it's actually done that way on purpose. Okay, when they studied leadership across different cultures, they came up with 65 different traits. Okay? And so they're trying, over a decade of research and a team of researchers, they're trying to understand these 65 different leadership traits as practiced within different cultures. 35 of those traits they determined to be culturally contingent, which means some cultures thought they were really important and some cultures thought they weren't important at all. So these are all of the traits that basically they couldn't get a global consensus on. Does that make sense? So peruse this list for just a second and see if you see anything up there that is surprising, alarming, disconcerting, encouraging. So look at that for just a second. What reactions do you have to this list of culturally contingent leadership attributes?
What does worldly mean?
I'm sorry?
Worldly?
Worldly.
Yes.
Grounded in the now, very much present tense. Some might, go toward the consumeristic type of experience, but very much in the now. If you're going to get it, you get it now.
So Josh, am I hearing you correct that some of those attributes in some cultures are considered a positive leadership style?
Some of these are considered very valuable in other cultures.
So some of those words that would jump out at me are like someone that's cunning,
Yeah.
or someone that's evasive. The things that in my leadership style that would be a negative, in another culture they're seeing as a positive attribute, and that may, if I'm going to do leadership with a cross-cultural leader, I need to understand, well, he may be the leader in position he is because he's an evasive, cunning dude.
Right, yeah. You would have to really watch out if he's both of those, right? Yeah, for sure. Yes, sir.
It appears to me a lot of these are the end member values. Some of them on this end, some of them on this end. Like intuitive and logical, right next to each other, but they're kind of the polar ends of the spectrum.
Some of these definitely are polar opposites of others.
Right, yeah.
Absolutely. And I would say, and the researchers would definitely say if they were here, that most of these are themselves a continuum, right? So indirect could be evasive, it could be vague, and that would express itself very differently depending on the context. Status conscious may mean something in one part of the world that it doesn't mean in another part of the world. Intragroup competitor looks very different. Just in the United States, look at different regional attitudes as far as competition or consensus building, and you'll see that come about. You'll see sincerity would be one way of putting it, but we'll talk about direct and indirect communication preferences, and you can even see that within the United States and the differences there. So any other thoughts about what you see on this culturally contingent?
Josh,
Yes, sir.
I thought some attributes like self-effacing, evasive, sensitive, subdued is very cultural, typical Chinese culture.
Sure.
But from the study of leadership books, many of them, I suppose these attributes are not good, are not constructive for the leadership. But you put it here, seems that all these attributes are still good. in different setting that might be good for leadership.
Yeah. Well, and actually, we're going to talk about that in these next coming slides because depending on where you are in the world, leadership looks vastly different. And Americans are known for a particular kind of leadership style that in many parts of the world is not at all how you practice or should practice leadership. And so, yeah, we're gonna play around with those in a second based on the research that was done, because there are a lot of elements on here that are highly valued among leaders in other parts of the world, and so we'll talk about that. Yes, sir.
I like to pick on evasive. That's a trait, and of course, there's a history to it. When, for example, in the Philippines, it's a survival skill.
Sure.
We were colonized by Spain for more than 300 years, colonized by Americans for a number of years, and if you confront these oppressors, you'll get killed right away.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that became a survival skill for us. If you want to survive, then you have just evade.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't confront the oppressors.
That is a survival skill, not leadership skill.
But it's really
Yeah, it depends who you're trying to lead, though, right?
Yeah.
If you're trying to lead the countercultural elements, you actually have to teach that skill, right? And so yeah, I mean, but this is why playing around with topics in leadership gets to be fun, because some people's definition of leadership means one thing and some people means something else. Dominant and subordinate cultures, even within regions, plays a lot into what is considered good leadership. You had something, yes, ma'am.
I just have a couple of questions for you. These are church people?
No, in fact,
Not church people, I mean, the ones who created the list.
no, these are
This is like the world.
These are actually managers on a global scale. In fact, I'll show you. This all comes from, and this is in your bibliography, this comes from the Globe study, which was a 10-year study done across 17,000 different managers. That's their sample size. And so they looked at almost 1,000 different organizations, and what they were trying to do was figure out where countries are similar and where they are different in their approaches to leadership.
My question was, because a lot of churches are they are going to what they call it the leadership of Jesus. So I was trying to find out if that was created by what you just answered the question. But if I'm talking, it came to my mind. So if I'm talking that I'm trying to take the word of Jesus to other places, then I have to consider the leadership of Jesus.
Sure.
That's right. So that's what I just didn't know if it was created by.
Well, yeah, and so I'm going to go back to this, so anybody taking pictures of that. So if you layer in the teachings of Jesus on top of some of these cultural values, you get vastly different expressions of Christian behavior, leadership, that kind of thing. If there are cultures that really value direct confrontation, they will gravitate toward different stories in Jesus' life. I mean, like overturning the tables in the temple is one of their favorite stories, right? Like, this is how you tell people what's going on, you know? And if you have cultures that value not evasiveness, but indirect confrontation, they will gravitate toward turn the other cheek, right? So you have all of the, there is a tendency, and actually we talked about this idea of biblical servant leadership in the second Leadership Cafe that we did. There is a tendency among some leadership scholars to say, here's leadership and here's Christian leadership, and it's its own little animal. And I'm in the school that says that that's not true. I think you bring the teachings of Jesus to culture, to organizations, to various things, and work it out. I mean, there's work to be done there, right? But I don't think there's this element of we're going to lead all worldly kind of leadership methods aside, and now we're going to go lead like Jesus. There are other issues involved there, I think. So,
and Josh, it's fascinating when there's this tendency when you talk in Christian circles about we just need to lead like Jesus did. And the funny thing to me is that a lot of times when you read the books that tell you how Jesus led, he sounds very much like an American manager.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
really fascinating to see, like, when you go to the biblical material about how Jesus led, different groups will pick out vastly different principles and say Jesus is, and it starts looking remarkably like their context.
Sure.
Yeah, and so you get very different ideas of how Jesus led. And so I think, and you're right on this, a better way to look at that is how does the way Jesus led speak to and challenge my cultural leadership style?
Yeah, and there's a bridging process. You know, people with missionary experience, you all know this. You spend time not only learning biblical truths and your own culture, but you learn the other culture too, because there's an interpretation process that you're going to have to go through. You're going to have to learn the stories that those cultures gravitate to and the ones that they gravitate away from, if you're going to be able to engage that culture. And the process of that kind of cultural interpretation looks very similar if you go from one family background to another. You know, if you were raised in a particular kind of family background and you marry into a different family background, you are doing a lot of cultural interpretation. You're just calling it, well, we celebrate Christmas differently this way, or for some reason they use ham at Thanksgiving when everybody knows you use turkey, right? I mean, it's those kind of things, right? So cultural interpretation is a skill that a lot of parts of the world practice without actually calling it a skill. And for some people, it's just a survival mechanism. So this study, the Globe study, and again, so the Globe study, the findings are like 800 pages long. So I'm going to do you a favor and kind of summarize the 800 pages. But if you are really dedicated to this and you want to find this out, this is probably the most well-researched experience into cultural understanding that has ever been produced, really. The sample size, the number of researchers, I mean, these guys really went after it. What they went after was trying to understand regions of the world and how they approach leadership. They were also kind of hunting for what are the ways that we understand what culture is, so what are the dimensions of culture, and then what are the leadership behaviors that correspond to those different dimensions, all right? So just very quickly, they produced a wheel that looks like this, which is, and I'll give you a minute to look at this, and they grouped countries of the world into clusters, 62 countries specifically, into different clusters. And the way that you kind of read this wheel is, like the arrows, you have Anglo culture on the one side, and then you have Middle Eastern culture on the other, as they have defined it. In their research, those cultures are most diametrically opposed. Does that make sense? Those cultures are most different. And so you have Latin European down here, and you have Southeast Asian up there. Those cultures are most diametrically opposed.
It's kind of like some of the personality studies that are
right
today for incorporation to the United States.
Absolutely, yeah. And so now they're going to take these clusters and try and understand them in the terms of cultural dimensions and leadership dimensions. Okay? So you'll see this bear out in just a second. So this is the wheel. You don't have to memorize the wheel, but that would be a really cool thing if you could just memorize it like that, though. That you could do tricks at parties and stuff. So 9 different cultural dimensions. So let's walk through this very, very quickly here. Power distance is one of those cultural dimensions. Now this is the expectation of power to be distributed equally. Another way of looking at this is the culture very hierarchical or very egalitarian? Is power shared among everybody, or is it the expectation that the bosses, the political leaders, the military generals, whatever, they have vastly more power than the people in the bottom ranks, and that is okay, right? That's kind of the expectation. So there are certain Asian cultures that are very high power distance, very hierarchical, right? In fact, in one of the books we talk about, if you, she actually used Chinese leaders as an example, Chinese business leaders, that the boss is right. Even if you think he's wrong, he's not. Like, the boss is right, because the boss is the boss. And if you want to challenge the boss, you better find a really, really nice way of doing it in a very respectful way, in a way that allows that person to save face, because there is an established hierarchy. If you go to other parts of the world and you walk into a meeting where there is a leader and some subordinates, there are cultures you won't be able to tell who the leader is, because it is such an egalitarian environment. The playing field is so level, and what that would mean is that they have very little power distance. Does that make sense? So that's power distance. So kind of hold that for right now. Uncertainty avoidance is another one. There are cultures, and this is, there are cultures that value concreteness. There are cultures that like predictability. And then there are other cultures that hold that very loosely. We don't have to be able to predict the future. We don't have to know what's coming. We certainly don't have to be able to analytically forecast it. And then there are other cultures for whom that's a very high value. Okay? That's uncertainty avoidance. And then there's this thing that they call the humane orientation. This is, it rewards people for being fair, altruistic, generous. Okay? There is probably a link between this humane orientation and low power distance, right? But this is the element of culture that says we want to care for the least of ours, the least of these, right? And then there are other cultures for whom they're like, nope, survival of the fittest. You get what you want and what you strive for, and it's nobody's job to help you get those things. Okay, so there's a humane orientation. Stop me if you have a question. Then there are two types of collectivism. The first one is very institutional, and it says, organizational and societal institutional practices encourage and reward collective distribution of resources and collective action. That's code for, in specifically institutional settings, consensus is a must. Okay? You must make the decisions as a group. Okay? Then there is an in-group collectivism, which is a high level of pride, loyalty, value in the small unit, usually the family. Sometimes the company can lean on these values in certain cultures, but this is so this is where we start making jokes about University of Texas and Texas A&M. Okay, very high on in-group collectivism and opposed to each other's in-group collectivism. Does that make sense? Right? This is where we get college rivalries from, because they are leaning on in-group collectivism. Excuse me. Now, and then you have four more. You have assertiveness, which pretty self-explanatory there. But this is, remember, this is not, don't think of this as some cultures are assertive and everybody in that culture hates that. Think of this as some cultures are assertive and that's the way you do things, right? Because culture informs what is best. So there are some cultures that are naturally more assertive than others. There are also cultures that are more gender egalitarian than others. What is the role of women versus men? Are there distinct differences? Are there differences that people value and pride themselves on and are built into the norms of that culture? So egalitarianism. And then there are two orientations here. Future orientation, and this says individuals engage in future-oriented behavior such as delaying gratification, planning, and investing in the future. This is kind of the opposite of what we were talking about, the worldly trait there. This is the opposite of worldly. This is we're planning for the future, we're investing for future generations, we're building up the storehouses. That is a very much a future orientation. And then there's a performance orientation. The collective, which is the group, encourages and rewards group members for performance improvement and excellence. These are cultures that are determined by their metrics. Okay? Now, knowing that those are there, you have different leader styles within those cultural dimensions. And this is where you start to bring in different cultures from around the world, different segments. This performance-oriented style, right? Driven by metrics, driven by the need to innovate, driven by the need to instill passion in people, right? Not surprisingly, this is very high for Americans. right? Because every leadership book that you read, if done at all well, is going to talk about passion somewhere in there, right? Passion of the leader, getting the passions going among your followers, specifically passionate to achieve some level of performance, right? All of this is starting to sound very distinctly American, because Americans rate very high on the performance-oriented style of leadership. Now, in Middle Eastern cultures, they rate toward the bottom of this research for this particular style, okay? And you will see the cultures kind of bounce around in these different veins. Team-oriented style, loyalty, collaboration, cohesiveness, this is that collective idea. Southeast Asian and Confucian cultures, right? And to know what those are, Southeast Asian over here, the specific countries, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Thailand, and Iran, and then the Confucian, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, South Korea, and Japan. Those cultures very high on team-oriented style. Middle Eastern and Germanic cultures rate very low on that. Now, so far, you tell me, is this ringing true or not? What are you basing that on?
There's a lot of mixture. It's not so clearly divided in.
Absolutely, but once PhDs get a hold of something,
Look at someone in Taiwan, big businessman,
Sure.
and he also encouraged participation, but he is also very strong, very authoritative people.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So there's a combination of the feature. It's not just either or.
Sure, yeah. No, I would agree with you. It's interesting that you talk about being the boss, right? Because on this next one, this participative style, input for decision making, delegation, and equality. So this is one of those. So you see, Confucian and Middle Eastern scored very low for this particular, because it doesn't align well with the hierarchy, but they score very high for team and collaborative efforts. And so they talk about this in one of the books about how do you combine a collective attitude and a hierarchical attitude at the same time, right? But you just described that inherently. I mean, you just said this is Chinese culture, right?
No, I'm not particularly saying this is Chinese culture,
Right.
but what I observe now, very prominent businessmen doing big business, and the leadership style seems to be quite a mixture of.
Absolutely, yeah. And none of these lines are going to be perfectly clean, right? I mean, whenever you get culture, we're talking about a vast number of shades of gray. But yes, sir.
So the solution is to integrate. Because really, like for example, I'm going to work with a participatory culture, but yet the domain wants to have a vision with a top-down. So for example, last Sunday I cast a vision, but the vision is not a vision of Young Lee, but a vision of the church that is ongoing and participatory.
Right.
So the ideas of Maxwell's and Heibel's and all that I jettison all that, because in a sense I only take it one part of it, which is essentially I must lead.
Right.
But the way I lead gotta be different.
The way you lead needs to align to the values of the people that you're attempting to lead. Yeah.
So it appears that there is a vision,
Sure.
but I coined it not as a vision, but a direction.
But if you, that's true, absolutely. And so, absolutely. So you're using the language, right, that's going to align to that value, but also get the job done, right, that they expect. And leaders have different jobs in different cultures, right? I mean, in an American, specifically in an American business context, if the senior most leader does not have ideas, they probably are not going to rate highly as a leader. Now, people may love working for them, the company may be very successful, but there's a stereotyped expectation of an American executive that they have to have a bold vision, ideas, innovative, that kind of thing. But in other cultures that are much more either participatory or team-oriented, they may come up with those ideas by spending months or years working at every level of the organization to get everybody on the page, so that when they say, this is the vision for the organization, it's not leader woke up one day and go, I think this is a good idea. But there's been a lot of work and collaboration to go into what the vision is. So vision casting looks vastly different in different areas of the world. And so you see different styles here. The humane style, rates differently. I was listening to a YouTube talk even this morning, talk about, a guy got a ticket in Norway for a parking violation. And he was Norwegian, and he's talking to a room that obviously had some Norwegians in it. And he said, so I decided to call, effectively, the Department of Motor Vehicles and see if they would excuse this ticket. And the room bust into laughter because they're like, dude, you're in Norway. There's no compassion for a traffic violation, man. I mean, it's the rule. Follow the rule. It's not hard. I mean, they painted lines on the ground and say park inside the lines or don't. But he tells the story of trying to talk to this person. He said, I was on the phone for 10 minutes. I gave it my best go. But no, because Nordic culture rates very low for the humane style, right? They would gravitate toward the policies and the rules and not toward the individual faces, right? Not toward the humanity of it. There's an autonomous style, independent, individualistic. Not surprisingly, Germanic culture score very highly on there. Eastern European culture score very highly on there. Anglo, United States, UK scores very high on there. Latin America scores low in the independent and individualistic, right?
Go ahead.
I served one time as a VCCT Executive Director Search Committee, and when we were picking the directory, some people came here and say, I don't know what you're going to do. I'm going, when I become your leader, VCCT, okay, the executive director, actually, Dr. Hardage, your boss now. He said, I'm not going to tell you what to do yet. I'll be here 6 months, and I gather you together, and we'll see what we can do. But someone came and say, we need to change. And I know how to change it. Yeah. You just follow me. Okay, later on we pick this one. Yes. Who want to learn from this. What is the right leadership? Leadership is supposed to lead and tell them what to do, or I want to get you to give me ideas, so I need you to do that.
There is no one right leadership. But I would say there is probably more effective and right leaders depending on a context than others. So if I came in to even an organizational culture or a church culture that valued a lot of collaboration, and I stood up on my first day and said, forget what we've done for the last 25 years. I have a fresh vision, right? Yeah. I mean, like immediately I would be killed, right? They'd just drag me off stage. You'd never find my body. It would be over. Now, and the reverse is true. If they are hiring me for a bold vision, organization, church, nonprofit, whatever, and I come in and say, well, I don't have any real ideas, but we're going to talk, we're going to share. You're already laughing, right? Because you know that that's not going to go well for me either. And so I don't think that there is a universal correct kind of leadership, but I do think that your leadership better align to your culture, or at least you have to understand what your culture is in order to shape that. I mean, I do think that there's a play between leadership and culture, but it's all based in values, right? So if you value collaboration really highly, you better have some collaborative leadership skills.
So even in America here,
sure,
business circle or political circle or religious or circle, they might have different.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and different within generations and different within racial groups. And I mean, my brother works for a tech firm. It's very low power distance, which means the CEO of the company sits at the table next to him. He is very much not the CEO of the company. Nobody has an office. They're just one big team, and they collaborate and they do their things. But you take that looks vastly different than Microsoft, Google, IBM. I mean, pick a big tech company where the cultures are drastically different. And you're talking about the same industry. So there are absolutely different values. And churches do this, and nonprofits do this. Yeah, Cliff, what were you going to?
I think we need to understand that sometimes culture was not necessarily defined, and just pulling all this together in my own head, by ethnicity.
Oh, absolutely.
So, I mean, these different leadership styles can flow from, like your brother's tech group, to leading different than a church. I mean, we have the multitude of different cultural leadership styles within our America. I mean,
Sure.
corporate America. Yes.
Absolutely.
And so if you're going to go in and try to be an influencer in a certain setting, you better understand their leadership style.
Yeah,
Is that right?
absolutely. I coached a church planter who was moving from Shreveport, Louisiana to Loveland, Colorado. And so the giggles, you start to know what this guy's going to encounter. And he, which isn't a shot against him necessarily, but it's going to impact how he engages culture. He speaks like he's from Shreveport, Louisiana. And so he's moving to Loveland, Colorado, where they very much do not speak that way. He's bringing with him a whole truckload of cultural values. You know, he's coming from the South. He's coming from different church culture. He's coming from, I mean, you know, and he's moving to an arts community on the edge of the Rocky Mountains, where they have 4 seasons and the whole bit, you know, I mean, like, so he said, do you think it's going to be a little different there? And I was like, a little different? Like, it might be a little the same, but other than that, it's going to be vastly different, you know? So yeah, absolutely. There's all kinds of play here. Now, I want to introduce you. I'm sorry, go ahead, yeah.
Can you just, in the case of, like, it says Germanic and Latin America, I just have a question coming.
Sure.
Are they also taking into consideration the migration patterns? Because, for example, a lot of people from Germany went to South America, and they, you know, a lot of high-class people send their kids to Europe. So you are having the leaders like formatted like in Germany, but you're talking Latin America with the indigenous patterns also. So I find it like a very much like, who knows? Because we're getting a lot of independent, individualistic people in South America as leaders, and they're creating a lot of trouble because of that. So I just find it like not really a match.
Well, yeah, and I think you will have ongoing discussions along those lines as immigration becomes easier, the world becomes more and more flat, cultures continue to interplay with each other. You'll see a lot more of the melding of cultures, and you've seen that even here. You know, Clint was saying he's a 5th generation Texan, but that means actually his family was here before Texas was. So, you know, I mean, so is he a 5th generation Texan? Is he just, you know, native to the dirt right there, whatever it was called, whichever of the 6 flags were flying over it at the time, you know, but where did your family come from before that? Germany. Yeah, Germany. So there's some German roots, 5th generation Texan, except Texas isn't that old yet, and so we've got German, Texan, whatever was here, but you know, I mean, all of that swimming around in his particular family, and then you multiply that family by a region or by a nation state, and you really get cultures playing against each other. And so countries that have been isolated for a long time have much easily defined cultures than cultures who have been very permeable over that same amount of time. And you will see this come to play more and more as people begin to travel, as ideas get exchanged. I want to introduce you to a resource. It's a book that is on your handout. If you went to the Global Leadership Summit last year, offered by Willow Creek, or saw it, you heard this person. Her name is Erin Meyer. She approaches culture. She wrote a book called The Culture Map. And she approaches culture in a very similar vein to the Globe study. It's not the robust research base. She does a lot of it through her own experience, but she does a couple of things that makes it a good read and probably worth your time. For one, she is an American woman married to a French national, a French man. She speaks fluent French, fluent English, obviously, but she's from Minnesota, so she brings the Minnesota aspect to it. Lives in Paris, does cross-cultural consulting as a profession, and what she did was, over time, and whatever her research base was, she took pains to define culture along similar dimensions, but also allowed for understanding where one culture relates to another and helping you kind of navigate that. So like on a communication scale, she talks about low context and high context, which means explicit versus implicit. In order to understand how people communicate, do you have to have a lot of knowledge of the culture or not? So Americans are very low context communicators. We are bottom line, I'm going to tell you exactly what I think, and that is a value prized in our culture, right? Say it like you mean it, spit it out, all of those things. Versus, and so she's got Germany, France, China, and Japan all sliding more and more to high context communication cultures, which is you need more and more cultural understanding to work in those areas. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I do recommend the read, or if you get the opportunity to hear her speak, she tells some really good stories. She does a lot of classrooms where cultures come together and share stories, and so she's got a lot of those disaster type stories too. But does a good job with the culture map. The other thing that she does that I wish the Globe study did is she contrasts different behaviors into grids, and so you can see how different cultures actually plot out when you have a culture like Japan that tends to avoid confrontation, and tends to meaning it does constantly avoid confrontation, but is also emotionally unexpressive, okay? As opposed to a culture like, and the Philippines, you can back me up on this, or back Aaron up on this, she would say the Philippines avoids confrontation, but is emotionally expressive. Which means that in those, upper right-hand emotionally expressive cultures, but avoiding confrontation, if you attack the idea, you are also attacking the person, right? They are connected together. Passionate people, but because they are conflict avoidant, right, or confrontation avoidant, they tend to bruise easily. As opposed to the opposite end of the spectrum, where you have the Dutch, the Danes, the Germans who love vigorous debate and are taught in school to do vigorous debate, and that's the only way you get at the guts of an idea is you reality test it, right? You are searching for, there's a word in German, you are searching for the objectivity of an idea. And so you criticize it and you slash it and you do all of these things to it, but you are never in that attacking the person with the idea. And so they may go through an hour-long vigorous debate, walk out, and still be best friends, right? Whereas in these cultures over here, you can't do that, right? Like that just doesn't happen. And so Aaron Meyer does a good job of contrasting different behaviors and different attitudes and exposing kind of how they mix together. So I wanted you to see that. There were, in the Globe study, a couple of universally desirable leadership traits, leadership attributes. They came up with this list of 22 that across all of these managers, the vast majority of them identified this list as being universally desirable in their leaders, which I think is, and if you look at this list, especially with a Christian background, you might be encouraged to read. So honest is on this list. That's good. Universally desirable. We don't like leaders that lie to us. Everybody on the globe can agree on that. Team building, dependable. There are some things there. Also in the same study, they identified 8 universally undesirable leadership traits. which you get ruthless on this list, so good. Nobody in the world wants a ruthless leader. Dictatorial, there's probably a connection there. Loners, egocentric. I wrote my dissertation on narcissism. I might argue with that last one a little bit. So universally undesirable leadership traits, which brings us back to this question. What is leadership really that includes some element of a global competency? When we talk about being globally competent as leaders, what does that mean? Does it mean that you are an encyclopedia of global knowledge and cultural knowledge, and you know the mores and norms of every culture, and you could just think we could drop you from a plane on any country in the world and you would know exactly how to conduct yourself and talk, and you would know, do you cross your legs here or you don't cross your legs here? Do you show the bottom of your feet here or not? Do you shake hands right, left, or never? I mean, all of that. Is that what it means to be globally competent as a leader?
No, I believe it's like the concept of worldviews.
Mm-hmm.
You have an understanding of all different worldviews, and yet you be aware of it, and therefore continually learning and trying to be competent, because obviously it's a process, you're progressing.
Sure.
So you're never going to be, knowing all the cultures, but as long as you are at the place where you realize this is happening. So there are a lot of like similarly, like lots of worldviews out there.
Sure.
But if you understand that's what's going on, and here's your biblical worldviews, and so I think you would have a handle of that. And so
yeah, I mean, if you had to have every culture memorized, we can't even do that in the United States. If you are in Texas and you order a Coke, what are they going to bring to your table?
exactly.
They're not going to bring you Pepsi unless they want to get fired. But if you say, I'd like a Coke, what are you asking for?
Coca-Cola.
Really? Yeah, you are asking for a soft drink, because if you say, I'd like a Coke, they will say, we have Coke, Diet Coke, Dr. Pepper, Sprite, But if you go to Colorado and you say, I would like a Coke, they are bringing you a Coca-Cola. Okay? Now, you're right, yeah. You could also ask for, like, if I go to my mom's house, I'll say, I'm in the mood for some pop, right? But you wouldn't say pop down here. You'd say a Coke, but not really mean a Coca-Cola. In other areas of the country, you'll say soda, Are there any others? I can't think of any. But my wife did missions, she did a mission trip in college for a summer, and she was going to Oregon from Fort Worth. And they made this huge chart of what they called, like, is it Coke or is it just cola or soda or pop? Or is it a feeder road? Is it a, what are the other ones? Access road, thank you. So all of we can't even do this in the United States. So it would be a little unfair to say, okay, if you're going to be a global leader, memorize the globe and all aspects of the culture. But yeah, what else?
It seems to me that you not only have to have sensitivity to the diverse culture that is in the group where you are, but an ability to sense where that whole group is going to have to go, and challenging each of those otherwise cultural end members in order to move it to a new place. So I think it's not just the ability to sense where you came from and knowing the cultures is necessary, but the skill set to say, okay, where are we going to become directional?
Right.
And the ability to help people develop a consensus about a new culture.
Because if leadership is the movement of a group from point A to point B, right, you got to have, but you also kind of have to understand, how is the culture going to value the process of movement, the instigation of the process, the metrics by which the process is defined. All of that's culturally based, right? All of that's based in values.
I think that's also why some of the things that are universally acceptable, some of those skill sets are really necessary to make that process work.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about a global mindset, these, and Pastor mentioned several of these, this is really what we're talking about, right? We're not trying to go for an encyclopedic knowledge of culture, though it will help in certain circumstances. Though, and Keelan's going to talk about this in just a second, admitting ignorance in a lot of cultures is the golden ticket, right? Rather than trying to assume you know the culture in and out, If you just show up and say, I have no idea, what are we doing here? You know, and you seem willing to learn, right? And you seem sensitive, open-minded, you're willing to communicate, you're willing to learn and be flexible and adaptable. These are the things that make global leaders distinct from people who really can't work in cross-cultural environments. So I'm going to introduce you to Keelan Cook. Keelan Cook is the newest UBA staff member, team member. Keelan comes from a global resume. He's been all around the world, engaged cultures all over the place.
Josh,
Yes, sir.
is that possible? A real leader will still lead, even inspire. He can despite all this cultural stuff. He is a real leader. He creates something new beyond this cultural.
Can you lead apart from a cultural context?
Yes. If he is a strong leader.
I'm going to say no. Only because the definition of strong leader is different from culture to culture. A strong leader in a Chinese context is going to look very different than a strong leader in a Brazilian context. Or, this is the same, when people say, oh, he's Hispanic and all Hispanic cultures are the same, that's not actually true either, right? Am I telling the truth? So I think leadership is very dependent on cultural values. Now, that isn't, this list of universally desirable. If you demonstrate trustworthiness, that speaks in every culture, right? But if you are assertive, that doesn't speak in every culture, according to the research that's done. So, Keelan, help walk us through the 5 F's. The
Sure.
stage is yours.
Probably easiest way for me to talk about it is give you guys an example of something. So Josh told you that I served as a missionary for a while, and to walk you through a distinction that I learned while being a missionary helps me think through how to be globally fluent or globally competent when it comes to trying to understand leadership styles. So when I signed up to serve as a missionary with the sending agency that I went through, they took me through this long process of orientation, right? I spent 8 weeks at a facility where they had a whole bunch of missionaries that were coming together to learn how to go be a missionary or do cross-cultural ministry and in some sense be a cross-cultural leader. And the way that worked is we spent 8 weeks talking about worldview, we spent 8 weeks talking about language, and we talked about church planting and theology and all these different topics, right? But what they did not teach me was the culture of the people I was going to work with. And there's a number of reasons that they didn't teach me that. One, there were 300 potential missionaries in the room going to 300 different places. And so how in the world could they have taught all of us an individual culture? The other reason they didn't teach it is because they were more concerned about teaching me not to be an expert, but in how to acquire. And those are very different things. Very often we think of, and this is the question that Josh asked earlier, we think of this issue as one of, I need to be somehow a cultural expert in order to lead in a cross-cultural setting. That is not true. We need to reframe our paradigm on that one and instead think about not cultural expertise, but cultural acquisition. So the question for us becomes then not how do I memorize every culture? Instead the question becomes how can I have a skill set that allows me to decipher any culture that I find myself in. It's a very different thing, but it will serve you longer term to be able to do that kind of work. And there's a whole lot that goes into that idea in and of itself. Josh told you culture's like an iceberg, and you've got implicit and explicit ideas in culture, right? Explicit's the ones that they're easy to see. They're the things that we would realize just by looking at a culture. Okay, they're different from me in this way. The implicit ones, though, that's what's under the bottom of the iceberg, right? And those are the more rooted ideas. Those are the ones that run deep. They're the ones that affect your beliefs and your values and all those kind of things. And so they're the ones we really need to get at, but the problem is those aren't the explicit ones. Those are the implicit ones. So we need to know how to find out those implicit pieces. And there's a couple of reasons why this is a real important idea. One of those, hear this, culture is not static. Culture is not static. So it is helpful for us to be able to look through all these books and studies on culture. But one of the things that you very frequently see people doing, they realize I'm going to be in a cross-cultural setting and I have to do leadership in this setting. Or I need to train leaders in this setting. How do I do that? And so we turn to books. And all of a sudden the book tells us what it's like to be a leader in a Middle Eastern context. Or the book tells us what it's like to be a leader in an African context. And we start filling our head with these giblets of ideas, these bullet points of they do things this way and they don't do things this way. And they say this and they don't say this. And they have a high value here and they don't have a high value here. And the reality is that's about as true, or that's about as true as you can throw it. That is about how far that idea would go, right? Because culture is dynamic. And as a group forms, it forms its own culture. And so when we're thinking about organizational leadership of any kind, really, we've got to consider the fact that whatever organization it is we're trying to lead here is going to develop its own culture along the way. And one of the things that's so important in understanding cultural acquisition is being able to really drill down in what are the unwritten rules. That's part of being able to be a cultural leader, is understanding what goes unsaid that actually determines the way we do things. And every culture has those unsaid things, those implicit things. And being able to drill into some of that idea is something it's essential. The other thing is the fact that culture is not just static, or it's not that it's not static, it's dynamic, but also that culture is fairly idiosyncratic. Or at least it can be. And what I mean by that is it's personalized. An easy example of this one is when we start talking about world religions, for instance. It's real easy for us to say a Muslim believes and try to fill that in with a list of bullet points, isn't it? Or it's very easy for us to say a Christian believes and fill that in with a list of bullet points. But is that really true of any individual that we're going to talk about, or a particular group of people? At that point, we realize that it is not enough for us to have some list of categories or some list of concepts and go, oh, well, this is what culture is. So if we're going to have that global competency, we need to be able to figure out those things. So you go in with the mindset of a learner. When I went through my training to go overseas and serve as a missionary, they put me on a plane and had chocked my head full of things. But when I got off the plane in that country in Africa, I did not know one single word in the language. And I didn't know an ounce of the culture. But what they had trained me to do was ask the right questions. There is an author that I'm going to recommend to you guys right quick. His name is Dwayne Elmer. Dwayne Elmer served as a missionary for a number of years. He writes on cross-cultural communication. And in fact, does more writing for the international business context now than he does for missionary endeavors. But he's got 2 or 3 books out there: Cross-Cultural Servanthood, Cross-Cultural Conflict, and I think he has one called Cross-Cultural Communication. All good reads that help you think through some of this stuff. In there, he talks about this particular way of doing things in other cultures called the one-down position. And from an American perspective, it sounds rather backwards to the way we would think about leadership or understanding or learning about something. But what it's doing is you intentionally taking a position where you are one step below whomever it is you're trying to talk to. That really resonates in certain cultures, a lot of cultures, in fact, particularly collectivist cultures, honor-shame cultures. By stepping back and putting yourself into the position of the learner, it actually endears you toward people because they realize that they have an intrinsic value to you. They realize you need them in order to help learn and understand. So if you can put yourself into the learner, or the position of the learner, and in that position, ask the right questions, it allows you to get at that dynamic and somewhat idiosyncratic or personalized understanding of the culture. A real rough and ready tool to think through this are these 5 F's of culture. These 5 F's are used by a lot of people in a lot of places. In fact, if you Google this, you'll run across it and see it really all over the place. What you have here, and you can count them on your hand, are just 5 simple aspects that any culture is really going to deal with. So you've got fun, food, faith, finance, and family. By going in as a learner and asking questions that fall into each of these categories, you can start getting a picture of some group's culture. Don't assume you understand it because you read a book. Instead, sit down with the people and start working through some of these questions. It may not be a meeting where I sit across the table with them, but over time, as I'm just talking to people, developing relationships, having normal conversation, if I as the leader am in the back of my head realizing I need to find out these aspects of their culture, it's going to start filling in the blanks on how their culture functions and how it operates and what some of those unwritten rules actually are. An easy way to demonstrate this is to think through some of the questions that you might ask in order to get at these. Now, fun's probably one of the harder ones to get an idea around. When I say fun, a lot of times people will also use the word festivals. So what are the things that you and your group, your community celebrate? Now, what kind of things could that tell us about a culture? What are the things that you celebrate?
Things that are important.
Yeah, you start getting at some important ideas there. What else? Religion. You're absolutely right. You start getting at how it starts drilling down deep into some worldview issues, like what their belief system is, when you start looking at the things that they prize enough to celebrate. Or food. Food's a more abstract one when it comes to trying to figure out worldview, but obviously food is an easy one to start asking questions about, right? So if you ask questions about what types of food they eat or whether or not they take pride in their food, help me tease that one out. What are some questions you might ask about food? Other than, what kind of food do you like?
Why do you use spices?
Okay, all right. I think there's some good cultural stuff there too.
What's the typical one?
Yeah, what are some typical foods that you would eat? Anything else? Do what?
When do you eat?
When do you eat? That's a great question. That's an excellent question. You're getting at some really central cultural ideas there. So I grew up 3 meals a day, 4 if I was lucky, right? That's the way we did things in the town in the southeast where I grew up in America. When I moved over to Africa, I found that they didn't do it that way at all. And so I had to relearn an eating cycle. But there were some deep cultural reasons for why they did what they did. And it surrounds some of these other ones. And you'll see that these are all interconnected. They would only eat 2 times a day. They didn't have multiple meals during the day, but it revolved around their rhythms of life. And the rhythms of life were set by their worldview and their belief systems. And so you could see how some of those were interconnected, so to speak. That's a really great question to ask.
The why question that's important too behind the when.
Exactly. Why do you do that? That's a great point too. What do you do? How do you do it? But then there's a follow-up question with each of these, right? And that's where you start getting into some of that cultural stuff. Why do you do it that way? Why is it that way? And that's when you start drilling into a belief system. And the reality is because for most cultures, a lot of these things are unwritten rules. They're unsaid things. They're implicit. They may not know the why. And so you're going to start them on a process of discovering why they do what they do that way. The next ones down here are the ones where you really start getting some visible understanding of culture. Faith, finances, and family. Let me run to finance and then I'll hit faith and family next. So finances is not what do you do for a job. It may be that, but let's think broader. What other kind of questions can we ask about finances and why does that help reveal pieces of culture?
Even the currency, trying to exchange the money, how do you deal with it?
Okay.
What do you do with your money? What do you use your money for?
What do you spend your money on? That's another value question, isn't it? Yeah, how do you budget? So questions about budgeting talk to us about the future orientation or the event or now orientation of a culture, right? How much of your money do you save? None of it? You save none of your money? Well, odds are they're not a future-oriented group. But if they're one of these groups that puts back the lion's share of their money, well, all of a sudden you're seeing that they have a future orientation. They're worried about that rainy day down the road, right?
Secure retirement.
What's that?
Many Chinese people put less money for retirement.
Yeah, for retirement. Yeah, exactly. And so you've got that future orientation. So what you spend your money on, how you budget your money, how you make decisions about money is another one. So the questions that we ask about money can reveal to us if they're a consensus group or if they have somebody that handles that in more of a hierarchical fashion, right?
You can also ask about the reliability of the money. When I was in Russia, the Russian ruble was not reliable at all, and everybody wanted dollars. And actually, that spoke to more than their economic stance. That spoke to their position in the globe at the time.
Yeah.
And other things.
Yeah, that's right. So there's all kinds of questions you can tease out with that one. Now, faith and family, I think, are the most bald for this conversation. They're the ones that it's very easy to see how these lead to cultural issues. Faith, I'm just going to leave you with one caveat on this one, and we'll land the plane with family. On faith, move past the question of what religion are you. That question helps you very little when you're trying to understand or do cultural acquisition. But it's the one that we just want to gut run to. But what you do when you ask the question, are you a Muslim, or are you Hindu, or are you Buddhist, or are you Christian or not Christian, is you have now used your image of what each of those words mean. When they give you the affirmative, yes, I'm a Muslim, you have backfilled their definition with your definition of that word. So you didn't acquire their culture, you assumed their culture, if that makes sense. So instead, drill past the question of what religion are you, and this works in a gazillion different settings. I mean, if you are a pastor who is trying to help your church understand their community, if you are in a group, in a business leadership role where you're trying to think through your group's dynamics on worldview, being able to move past that kind of question instead of backfilling it with assumptions allows you to really get at what people believe. What is their foundational worldview? 4 questions when it comes to faith that really help identify things. Where did everything come from? What went wrong, if anything went wrong at all? You'll find most groups think that something went wrong somewhere. Right? Is there anything we can do about it? And then the last one, where's everything going? Where's everything going? And you'll notice there's a very easy leap to a gospel conversation in that. But past that, what it does is those are analytical questions as well. It's not just, hey, here's an easy setup for a gospel conversation in personal evangelism. But in addition to that, it helps you start getting at some of those deep-seated worldview ideas for someone. So for instance, we Americans, we're linear thinkers, right? And you'll run into, say, a South Asian culture or some East Asian cultures that are very circular in their thinking and their logic. That's a worldview idea. We, in our worldview, have a punctiliar start, and then it goes in a straight line, right? If we were to draw a timeline of existence, there was a beginning, one beginning, and then it runs on out through eternity. That makes us linear thinkers. However, in a Hindu background, they're circular thinkers. They believe in reincarnation, right? And so as far as they're concerned, there's not really a beginning or an ending. It's always been this way, and it will always be this way, and it just runs through these circular forms of existence. Well, that affects how that group dynamic works and how they make decisions about things if they're circular versus linear. And so asking a question about where everything came from and where it's going helps you start to see aspects of their culture, like are they a linear thinker or a circular thinker? Then finally, family gives you a whole lot about how group dynamics work. So what are some questions we'd ask about family?
When does your family gather? I mean, it's a bigger group.
Okay. And why does your family gather?
Who leads the family?
Who leads the family? Great question.
How do you define family?
How do you define family? This is a really good one too. So when I was in Africa, the way they defined family there was just fascinating to me. Because in the family unit in the villages where I worked, the birth father was called your father, and all of his brothers were also called your father. And so their family structure was fundamentally different. But it starts to reveal pieces to you about how their cultural dynamic works. What is the family unit and how are decisions made? So what wound up happening is their uncles had fatherly say-so and authority over them. In truth, they were very collectivist and they were a very consensus-building group. And so what would really happen is, so for instance, if someone was going to get married off, all of their dads would sit down and make a decision about how that was going to happen. And so by drilling into some of these kind of things, you start seeing how some of those dynamics work. So what you've got here is a real rough and ready, this is an oversimplification obviously, but it's a real rough and ready technique, to think through the different kind of categories that you'll see really in any culture. And as you ask questions, they're really normal to conversation, right? It helps you start to process what some of the deeper truths are about the way that they do things. And by doing this, you put yourself into a position where you can acquire an understanding of culture instead of just trying to go in as an expert with a preset understanding of what you think they are, if that makes sense. So that's that. Does anybody have... I'll land the plane on that. Anybody got any questions about it? Right quick. If not, I'll turn it back over to Josh and get out of the way.
So when you after you landed in Africa, you begin to pick up the real thing, your culture, and that help you to be effective.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly right. So what this does is it allows you to see those unwritten values. It's not something that happens in a moment. It's something that happens over time. Right? And so over time, as I am working in relationship with people, I start to gain a total picture of their value systems. And that helps me then develop an understanding of leadership competencies in that culture because I see what's important to them. I see they're big on consensus or they're big on hierarchy or different aspects of it that way. But it's possible to get to those things because most people aren't even self-aware about that kind of thing, right? Most people in a group can't sit down and tell you, are you real big on consensus building or are you real big on this other version of doing things? Most people aren't self-aware to that. But as you try to analyze those things, for you to be able to be globally competent or able to lead in a cross-cultural setting, you put yourself in a position to analyze how they function and it reveals those values.
It's a good thing that you did that, but there are a lot of missionaries, not really maybe a lot of missionaries, but a good number of missionaries have been in a particular culture for 20 years, but they have never changed.
No, you're absolutely right.
You want to change people. You know?
That's right.
But that's also well, it's not a question, but it's confronting me with what is it that is the truth of God here, because I'm going, I don't want to be confrontational, but I don't want to have a lukewarm, is that what that word?
Yeah.
So, just to make sure, because this is what's happening right now, everybody's saying whatever they think, make it like softer when there is a real truth, right? So how to approach, because you don't want to be ecumenist, whatever.
Sure.
Yeah. You don't want to give the impression that, everything is all right, reincarnation, peace and love. No, you want to also bring the truth. So
that is an excellent tension. The tension that you're feeling right now, I think, is the one that the leader feels, if that makes sense. And this gets back to what you were saying earlier about you're moving a group along a direction as a leader, right? And so just understanding values, and let me say this, as you are doing cultural acquisition and you develop a portrait of the culture of this group that allows you to understand their values, what is important, what isn't important, what they think highly of, what they don't think highly of. Now, don't just acquiesce to that. That's not necessarily leadership. It gives you the unwritten rules of the group, but from a biblical perspective, cultures are not bad, different cultures are not bad, they're different, but they are all fallen. And so the Bible is going to tell us that there are things about a culture that we should learn to work in those, we should learn to value that culture. At the same time, though, there are probably things they're doing or value that need to be prophetically confronted, right? And so that tension is one where when the leader can grasp it and understand it and move forward with it, I think they're in a good position.
I think a key word that I've had to remember dealing with that tension in the position of being a law enforcement chaplain and dealing with different situations is understanding doesn't equal acceptance, and acceptance doesn't equal approval. I can accept you and put value in you because you are a created human being, you have the image of God in you, but that doesn't mean that I approve of your behavior. I accept you as a person, but I don't approve of you. I may understand your culture, but that doesn't mean I accept your culture as something that I value.
But there's a little bit of difference when you're accepting people in your congregation and when you're going there.
Correct, yeah.
And get yourself into a different kind of environment, so.
That's right.
If we fail to move them, do you move yourself?
Well, that's a good question. I think the answer to that, and this is actually what I was fixing to say. So these questions, don't just ask these about the people you're trying to lead, ask these about yourself. If that makes sense. And so there's a level where in order to do cross-cultural communication of any kind, you need to be able to function in their terms, so to speak. You need to be able to get your message to where they are. And a piece of that is understanding in yourself what needs to go in this cultural setting. So, and here's where humility really comes into leadership, right? Is you've got to be willing to part ways with some of your own preferences and personality. And a lot of times, because they're unwritten rules, we think things are right because we do them that way. And that's really the only reason we think they're right. And so what we need to be able to do is ask this of us, ask this of them.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's right.
Let me offer what Josh had started saying, that you don't have biblical values here and then use cultural values and you're trying to usurp one over the other. I usually use this term called transcending. So you have a biblical values, we derive that from the scripture, but then you have cultures that are parts of it's fallen and some of it is good.
Sure.
But somehow there has to be a place where you have to be aware where the transcending of those biblical values, and that's very difficult. It's a lifetime, but
That's right. That's right.
we struggle, we learn. But I think if we come to terms with that, I think we're heading in the right direction. Rather like the extreme, we're saying, "Oh, this is biblical values," but then we don't realize it's actually Anglo values.
Right.
Whoa, that's wrong.
Right.
That's not biblical values. So we have to transcend it. We have to transcend it, but that transcendent attitude has to be like, a learning process.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right there.
Well, and thanks, Keelan. I appreciate that. The other thing to remember too is when it to some degree goes back to where we started, which is what is essential, what is core
to you, to your culture, to your thinking, to your beliefs, to your theology, and what are preferences. And when you are building relationships, whether you're using these questions, whether you're leading a team, whatever, the key to that process is remembering in that relational exchange, right? And in that talk of values and culture and norms and behaviors and all that, what is core and what's flexible? The people who are really good at cross-cultural ministry are the ones who know very clearly these are the things I will not move on, I will not sacrifice on. And it's a pretty short list.
Yeah.
This is the list I'm willing to die for. And then this is all the other stuff that I would prefer, I prefer to drink Coke over this, but whatever. Or I prefer coffee over tea, but hey, whatever. Or whatever your preference is, but all this other stuff is flexible. In the effort of leading people, in the effort of representing Christ well, whatever it is, the understanding of our own, like Keelan said, the understanding of our own culture and knowing what the values are, knowing what is core, and knowing that everything else is flexible, especially in the aims of the gospel, that's key to just building relationships with people, whether it's cross-cultural or not. We are out of time. And so I'm going to put this slide back on. I know this was drinking from a fire hydrant to some degree, but appreciate you all taking the time out of your daily schedule.
Sorry that we're letting you out as soon as the rain starts. That was not the plan. Should have let you out 2 minutes ago and you would have been just fine. But make a plan to join us for these two events as usual. This video will be available on the UBA website and on YouTube here in a couple of weeks. And so if you missed a slide or you missed a comment or you have a question, you can follow up there. So thank you all for coming. Have a good day.